Is anyone else having a hard time believing that 2023 is over? Like, where did the year go? I feel like I say that every single month. Like, where did the month go? I don't know how another month is gone, and I don't know how another year has passed. It's just kind of crazy. Honestly, 2023 was nuts. And there was so much that went on, so many amazing things that happened in life in general and with writing and author life and stuff. But I want to focus for a minute on the books that I've read in 2023. So in 2021, I had a terrible reading slump where I only read like 20-something books, which is not normal for me at all. And so since then, I've been trying to do like at least 3 books a month. I think that's totally doable for me, generally speaking. And this year, I actually considerably surpassed that. So I read 66 books this year. There were a couple that I DNF'd, which, I mean, I read most of it, I think. But overall, I read 66 books this year, which is awesome and way more than my 36 books a year thing, which, I mean, my second goal would be to hit 100, and I don't think that's going to happen any year soon because life. But there were some amazing books that I read this year, so I wanted to take you on a top 10 books that I read this year. I'm going to do them in the order that I read them because I have no idea how to order them by favorites. I'm not going to try to do like my top favorite and then 10 and all that stuff. That's way too complicated for me. So we're just going to do them by the order that I read them. But before we get into that, I just wanted to ask you, what were some of your top books that you read in 2023? I'm sure you have a favorite book, or at least 10 favorites that you might have read in 2023. So if you have a favorite book that you loved to read, or books that you loved in 2023, make sure to drop a comment, and I'd love to hear what your favorites were. So without further ado, let's get started with the top 10 books that I read in 2023. What's nuts is that the first book that made the top 10 was a book that I read very quickly after the start of the new year. So it was actually the third book that I read this year. We Were the Lucky Ones. This was just such a neat book. It's a World War II story that actually was real, which I think just makes it all come together so much more. I didn't realize that until I was basically done. It's just such a heartbreaking story. I was close to tears for the last half of the book. It's incredibly written, powerfully woven, and just incredibly heartbreaking. It's a World War II story that has so many different POVs, and we're watching all the different characters who are family and how World War II affected each of them personally. And it was just such a great story, and I absolutely loved it. So this was the first book that I read that made it onto my top 10 list. Another book on the top 10 list is Where the Crawdads Sing. I feel like this book just made like a huge splash in society, and I don't know if it was because of the movie coming out. I mean, the book itself was released in 2018, so it's not a brand new book, but I just read it this year. And I've seen so much about this book specifically this year. So my grandpa, my dad's dad read it and absolutely loved it. My grandma, my mom's mom read it and she loved it. And both of sets of grandparents happened to be down at the same time. And they were both telling me a little bit about it. So I ended up checking it out from the library and I read it that night. And I read the whole book that night. Oh my goodness, that was just such an amazing book. It tears your heart out. It's just so good, so well written. Basically, she lives by herself from the age of 6 in a marsh, and it's just the abandonment, and she's alone in the world, really, and she learns how to survive by herself. But she's viewed as a nobody, and worse than a nobody, really. She's viewed as a danger to society by the townspeople who don't like her. There's just so much pain in this story, the pain of her isolation, where she thought that she knew who loved her, and she thought that there were people that loved her, and then they go against her and things happen that are just so sad. It just really breaks your heart. But the story itself and the characters, it was just so beautifully crafted and well written. I will say there were a couple explicit scenes that had a little bit more detail than were needed for the story, so keep that in mind. But it was just so well written. Definitely not a kid's story, but I loved it. It was so well done. The next book I read is Russian Winter. So this was another war story, but it takes place in Soviet Russia. She just weaves the POVs together in such an amazing way that just kept me turning pages the whole time. whenever I would feel like, oh, I need to put the book down, then she would drop another hint, and it would just keep me turning pages and just kept me invested in the story. It's so good. It was just so cool how she wove the POVs together. We have a younger version, an older version, different timelines, but every time she'd drop a hint, it would correlate with another POV, and you just see all the puzzle pieces fitting together. It was just so well written, and the story itself was just engaging and absolutely amazing. So that was Russian Winter, and it was just so good. After that is Echoes of the Titanic. So this is another of the dual timeline sort of stories, and it was just so good. Honestly, I liked the modern POV more because, I mean, the second POV took place on the Titanic, and we all know how that ends. So the modern POV was just so good. They wrote an amazing contemporary POV, and I've read some really great contemporary books this year, which is not usual for me. I usually stick out in the historical area, but I had some new genres this year. And contemporary, I just really like contemporary books this year. I found some really great ones, and this one was no exception. So I loved how we bounced back between POVs. I just love that in books, generally speaking. But to have the modern POV as this book did was just so awesome. I love to see the puzzle pieces fitting together. That I feel like that's a thing I keep saying, but it's just so cool to watch all the hints fall together and everything comes together in some explosive moment that is really not great if you were living it. But that's what makes a good story, and it was a really good story. It left me thinking about it for days to come. Next, we have an amazing cyber mystery. So this was just so well developed and well written. It drew me in right from the beginning. It did not take me very long to read this book. I mean, it's not that long as it is, but it was just so good and so fascinating, and it's another contemporary story. I just love the characters in the story. Whatever romance developed so naturally. I never felt like Kimberly was trying to push it on you or just make it too much. And there was God it was a Christian story, so there was God in it, but I never felt like it was too much or overpowering or like that was too much of the story. I felt like it was just so tastefully written and it wove together so well. I'll also say the cyber attack in this story was just well written. She did not back down from the research part. Like, I felt like I was living it, and it felt so believable and so real, which, I mean, in stories when there's so many details like that, I feel like oftentimes the authors slack a little bit or they leave stuff to the imagination, whereas this felt so well researched, well developed. Overall, it was just such a neat story. So when I was narrowing it down to a top 10, it was really hard, honestly, because I've read like 66 books this year, and top 10 is difficult when there have been some really good books that I've read. That said, I merged two books to be together as a top 10 book. So we have these are part of the top 10 together. Honestly, I will say I think this actually made the top 10, and this was a really, really close runner-up. But I read the Ender Games series, and oh my goodness, it just knocked my socks off. I don't read much sci-fi. Let's just start with that. I primarily read historical fiction. Contemporary comes up next, probably. I love dystopian, but sci-fi just usually isn't my thing. And somehow July ended up being my sci-fi month. But these are just such good books. They're long books too. I don't love long books. They kind of overwhelm me a little bit. These were amazing, amazing, amazing books. If you ever need sci-fi novels, go here. These are just so good. I mean, Ender's Game was also really good, but I think Xenocide actually won the top 10, and this was the follow-up. I honestly don't know what to say, except it was just such an amazing story. The characters are incredible. It's just so well woven together. All the different elements were so well researched, so well written. They're just amazing books. Then we also have He Should Have Told the Bees with my beautiful customization, which ironically, I actually haven't done any more of this since I did this book, which was in the fall. I don't know, I just had a moment where I was just so excited about it, and I just had to do it right then. I did 2 books, and then I haven't done it since. Anyways, all that to say, this was such a gripping book, and it was just, the emotions were so sweet. I just loved the story. It's about a beekeeper, and there's a bit of romance, but it's really mostly about these 2 sisters who reconcile, and it's just so well done and so intriguing, and the emotions are just there. I just really enjoyed it. The Best Summer of Our Lives was probably one of the best books that I read this summer. It was just that good. We had all 4 characters, and it was just such a gripping story about summer, snow, autumn, and spring. The 4 best friends whose lives totally changed that summer that was supposed to be the best summer of their lives, but ended up probably being the worst summer of their lives. And it was just so awesome and so well written. I don't even know what else to say. It was just that good. After that, we have Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which definitely made it onto the list because it's just such a cool story. I read it for the first time right after I read the whole Hunger Games series for the first time, and I feel like it was kind of dwarfed by my new fascination in the Hunger Games series because I kind of hit a fandom, and I don't get into fandoms, and I got into that fandom. So I didn't feel like I really appreciated it quite as much after I had read the series for the first time, just because the emotions of the first series and reading it for the first time just... So getting to read it again for the second time right before the movie came out was just so awesome to revisit the characters. I personally was wanting to read it before the movie came out just so I could refresh my brain on what happened, but it was just such a good book. It's so long. It is that long, but it is that good. And the characters and all the emotions, it's just such an amazing villain story. I don't read many villain stories, but that was just a really top-notch villain story. Like, she wove it together so well, and all the emotions and all the characters, it all came together so well. I just loved it. So then the last book on my list of top books that I read in 2023 is a book I read in December. It has not been released yet. I beta read it for Kara Swanson. It is Ignite. So it's coming out this summer, and you gotta go pre-order it. It's just that good. It's so good. I read it so fast, and I just could not put it down. She is the queen of cliffhangers. So just getting that out there. But it was just such an amazing book. The emotions were so strong, and all of the story itself came together so well. There were so many moments where you just can't put it down because it's just that good. I absolutely loved it. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that story, make sure to check out December's reading recap, where I went into a little bit more detail about Ignite. It's just so good. So those were all the books that I read in 2023. So it was such a wild ride of stories. I went through so many different genres. I got so sick of historical fictions at one point, and I stopped reading them for like a month while I read sci-fi and dystopian and other random different genres. It was just such a wide read year with so many different genres, and it was just such a great year for reading. So I would absolutely love to hear what books you read this year, what made your top 10 list or top 5, or what was your altogether favorite book of the year. I feel like that is such a hard question for readers because you've read so many different books and it's so hard to narrow it down to one. So all that to say, make sure to drop a comment and let me know some of the books that you read in 2023 that you enjoyed. And I look forward to talking to you again soon. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again pretty soon.